A very warm welcome to another Raspberry Pi research seminar. I'm delighted today that we're going to hear from Professor Rose Luckin from the Knowledge Lab, University of London. And I'll introduce her in a moment. I'm just going to run through the normal sort of housekeeping. Those of you who are very familiar with it, you come regularly. So we're going to divide our session into three parts. First of all, Rose will talk to us for a little while, for 40 minutes on her presentation. Then we'll divide into breakout rooms and get an opportunity to share our thoughts on the presentation and think of some good questions or comments, and then we'll come back for general Q&A. So I'm delighted to welcome Rose. So Rose comes to us from the UCL Knowledge Lab. She probably doesn't need any introduction because she's very well known. So you maybe all know all about Rose already. Very impressed when I read her bio that she was named one of the 20 most influential people in education in 2017, which is amazing. She's founder of the Educate Ventures Research Limited, which is a London hub. And she's going to talk to us about what it is that makes AI useful for teachers and learners. And we've got this whole series of AI education talks. Rose is a little bit different. We've talked quite a lot about how to teach AI to young children. And I'm really excited about this seminar because Rose is bringing us another perspective and the usefulness of AI in education that I'm really looking forward to. Rose.
Thanks, Sue. That's lovely. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me. Now, it's really nice to be here, and I love the idea of these seminars and the way that you've got them structured. So you have some discussion time and then some questions. I think that's a really great idea. And I wanted to talk about what it is about AI that makes it useful for teachers and learners, but from the perspective mainly of what can we help teachers and learners, but it's a particular focus on teachers, understand about AI that will help them be able to leverage it as effectively as possible. So that's where I'm really coming from on this. I'm going to start, as always, and I'm sure you've heard this time and time again, as to why AI is in education is such a popular topic at the moment. And I think one of the reasons is because we are facing this fourth industrial revolution, as it's often referred to, and the rise of automation and the rise of AI and smart technologies in the workplace are certainly bringing about enormous changes in our lives. And that means that there are big impacts on education, and we need to think very carefully about what those are and how we deal with them most effectively. But the definition of AI is highly contested, so I'm going to be really broad in the way that I talk about it. And refer to it in the frame of technology capable of actions and behaviours that require intelligence when done by humans. So that's a very broad definition indeed. And the reason I believe that we're now facing this huge upsurge in the use of AI and now in its application in education and the implications of AI for education is because we have this perfect storm. We've got huge amounts of data that we can easily collect as people behave in the world. We've got very sophisticated algorithms, machine learning algorithms that can process this data. Now, I'm not promoting the view that machine learning is all that AI has to offer, but very much I'm looking at machine learning today. Plus, we have enough computing power and memory to allow us to run these algorithms and process this data through which the AI algorithms and the AI system learn and can behave in intelligent ways. So it's really this perfect storm of these three ingredients that are juxtaposed that make AI so powerful today. And of course, we're all using it all the time, aren't we? You know, if we speak into I do it all the time, you know, memos on my mobile phone, it turns my voice into text, very handy. A lot of people use smart home devices, voice activated assistants like Alexa or Siri. We use it when we're shopping, when we're searching, when we're tracking our fitness. And when we are allowed to travel, we often use it to help us navigate a city that perhaps we're not familiar with, or even one that we are familiar with. And all of this is driven by data. And so I think the big question that I like to consider is, how can data be used to improve learning, or improve teaching and learning if you prefer? Because certainly, you know, the well-worn phrase now, data is the new oil, is true, and it's made a lot of people very wealthy, just like oil. And it's certainly the power behind machine learning AI. And just like oil, it's crude. It's not refined in its core sense. And it's how we refine that data that gives it value. So if we want data to be the power behind human intelligence, we need to think about how that data is refined in order to help us to build the kinds of technologies, the kinds of thinking that will help us to leverage AI for the benefit of teachers and learners. But just before I delve a bit more into that data piece, I think it's useful to think about what AI can currently do for teachers and learners. If you're lucky enough to be in a part of the world where you have good broadband connectivity and devices, and you've been able to access some of these technologies. And so there are three ways in which AI impacts on education, in my view. It's useful to think of it in these three categories. The orange one is using AI in education to tackle some of the big educational challenges, and I'm going to start with that. But then I want to move on to talking about educating people about AI, but particularly teachers, so that they can use it safely and effectively. And I'm not really going to say anything much about the third category there, about changing our education systems, not because it's not important. I think it's fundamentally important, but just 40 minutes isn't quite enough time to cover all three and do them justice. So I'm really focusing on the middle one, but I'll also talk about that first category too. But just before I move on, I want to stress that I don't see these categories as mutually exclusive. I think they're highly interconnected. The more progress we make in one, the more progress we make in the next, and so they interconnect. Breaking it down is merely a useful tool for helping us to think about AI, its challenges, its benefits, and how we deal with it with respect to education and training too. So thinking about that first orange category, the ways in which AI can already be useful to teachers, and what is it about AI that can be useful? Well, one of the things is the fact that AI can adapt based on the learning from data. And that can be hugely useful. There are a whole host of adaptive technologies out there. I particularly like this one from Leno in the US. It's a platform called nSkills, ENSKILLS, and it's an English learning platform. And I like it because you run it through a browser. So with the right connectivity and technology, you can run it anywhere in the world. You talk to the character on screen, and the character assesses through the AI within the software your level of competency with spoken English and your ability to listen, because the character interacts with you and holds a conversation and gradually adapts to your particular level. And it's a nice, very usable piece of software. There are also a whole host of very good adaptive systems, not all of them using machine learning, some of these using, at least in part, some of the more old-fashioned AI methodologies from Carnegie Learning, such as this system for college level students to improve their maths. And then the UK-based Century Tech provides a platform that allows any curriculum to be used on that platform, and for the way the child, the learner, the student, could be a college student, interacts with the subject areas through the platform adapts to that learner's needs. So that's the propensity of AI to be adaptive that is useful. And certainly it can also be used for taking benefit of that adaptivity to recommend. So to go off, I'm a teacher, I want to find some resources that are particularly suitable for my students. So we can use something like TeachPitch, and find out what the most appropriate resources are that we can use. So that's not necessarily having any AI doing any of the interacting with the students, but actually really helping a teacher to refine the resources that they're choosing to work with students, because there's so much content out there. How do we get the right things? But then if we think about the way that we can connect sensory data through sensing devices to AI, we can see that actually, yes, advise, yes, recommend, but based on sensor data as well as historical information. So this is a little device from a company called Oya Labs, very, very, very young children. And the device you can see on the screen is a cloud with a sun coming out of it, and that sits in a very young child's room and monitors the sounds within that room, interactions with siblings, parents, whatever, and analyzes that sound and produces for parents through a smartphone app advice about how best they can support their child's language development. So that's very early years. And finally, an example from higher education, where again, I think we can see the ways in which AI can help teachers and certainly can help students. And this is about sensing and adapting. We have this nice system called SimSensei from University of Southern California, where we can see on the screen the lady sitting in the chair is a coach. She's obviously a simulated coach on a character that the student can interact with. And the coach will adapt the advice that she gives to the student according to the student's needs, based on the way that the algorithm that runs the software has learned from thousands of previous students. But in addition, this SimSensei AI will also receive real-time information, not just about what the student says and does, but how they're speaking, the tone, the speed, their facial expressions, so that this real-time sensory data can be combined with the other data that enable this particular coach to be better able to adapt to each particular student's needs. So it's a really interesting application of looking at multiple data sources to feed into an AI system to be able to support learners, in this case, students. But really the key, as I said earlier when I was talking about oil and data is the new oil, that data is hugely important, and it's what makes machine learning AI function, of course. And this is where I think we need to help, particularly help educators to understand the black box, if you like, of AI. And in this particular instance, the black box of machine learning AI. And so we've been working over a number of years now with different educational organizations, from universities to school groups to professional training organizations, trying to help them look at AI and work out the best way that AI can be used in their particular context. And through this work, we've developed a 7-step framework that we call the ethical framework for AI readiness. And this is about helping educators, parents, teachers, could be students as well, become AI ready. I'm a really big believer that AI is something that needs to be contextualized for most people to understand it. I'm not talking about people learning how to build AI or how to design an algorithm, select a data set necessarily. I'm talking about people getting the level of understanding that they need in order to understand enough about AI to know what it is and is not capable of doing, where its strengths are and its weaknesses, why data is so important to machine learning AI, and in a very general sense, how that data is used by the AI to learn. And there are lots of other AI readiness programs out there, mainly in large businesses such as PwC or KPMG, that are used by these companies to prepare their customers to use AI. But ours is specific to educational applications. And so we have our 7 steps. It starts off with enthusing people, helping them to understand why AI could be of interest to them, their school, their college, their institution. And then we take a particular challenge as the focus for looking at AI. That's the frame, the lens through which we explore AI. And that means that we get the double benefit, because we help educators, students to understand AI, but we also help them to understand a particular challenge they're facing through helping them to understand AI by using some AI methods. So that's where we need to find the right kind of challenge. We then go to step 3, which is about identifying data that already exists and is available. The C from ethical is about collecting the new data that's relevant to the particular challenge we're focusing on. Then we use A for apply. We apply some AI techniques to the relevant data to learn about the challenge that is represented in that data. And then we iterate, because we may decide that actually we need to go around again. Perhaps we need to refine the challenge and then try and find out more, try and understand more. But it's by helping particularly educators to think inside a machine learning algorithm, we hope to help them understand AI more, but also, as I say, to help them understand the challenges they're facing and the way in which AI may or may not be useful to them to tackle that challenge. This is very much about that question I posed at the start about how can AI be useful for teachers and learners. So I'm going to run through a worked example, because I think that's, and it is only an example, to give you an idea of how this might work, because I hope that's the best way of explaining it clearly. And I'll also add that we have a book being published by Routledge. They've got a new series called AI for Everything. And a couple of colleagues and myself, one of whom is a head teacher, a primary school head teacher, have written a book called AI for School Teachers, which also uses the 7-step framework. And again, trying to help educators understand enough about AI to be able to use it in a way that's beneficial. Now, I've got to say this example is highly simplified, because in a few 20 minutes, just over 20 minutes, it's hard to do anything in great detail. So bear in mind it is simplified. And of course, we make some assumptions, but nevertheless, I think it's useful for explaining what this framework is about. And I think it's important to point out that it's about how AI can help us understand our challenges and at the same time understand AI, because only then can we properly assess how AI could be used to help tackle some of the challenges that we face as educators. So it's the step before making a decision about bringing some AI into your school, college, university, or buying it for your own children if you're a parent, for example. So let's start. Educate, enthuse, excite. This is really about making sure that everybody, so say you're a school leader, it's really important that everybody in your organization understands why AI is being explored and what it could do. So to paint a picture of how it could help them with the very core needs that they have as a practitioner, and those needs might be very specific to a particular organization, although many are generic across different organizations. But the real starting point is this business of tailoring and honing. So finding particular challenges that you want to focus on. And it's really important when thinking about these challenges to understand the difference between human and artificial intelligence. And so I spent a lot of time a few years ago looking at the way in which we might talk about intelligence for an AI-enabled world, very much looking at the difference between human and artificial intelligence. Excuse me, I'm having a little trouble with my voice today. And came up with these 7 ways in which humans are intelligent, and these are not separate intelligences. They're elements of a very complex interwoven whole. And so, yes, interdisciplinary academic intelligence is what most of education focuses on. Yes, meta-knowing intelligence, by which I mean what we might have previously referred to as epistemology, as personal epistemology. What do I know about knowledge, where knowledge comes from? How can I make good decisions about whether I feel I have enough evidence to believe something to be true or not, for example. Social intelligence, a core part of the way humans interact and learn, supremely important, and increasingly so in the workplace when we need people to be able to solve problems collaboratively. And then another set of meta-intelligences. And the meta-intelligences are really important because they require us as humans to be able to reflect on our own thinking, to reflect on our own being as a human in the world, to reflect upon the way we're feeling at any moment in time. And so we have metacognitive intelligence, our ability to reflect on our own thinking, to plan, to monitor, to reflect, to change, to constantly reassess and regulate our thinking as we work towards the goals that we wish to achieve. And metasubjective intelligence, this is not just emotional intelligence, this is our ability to step back from our own development of emotional intelligence and query ourselves and say, how am I doing? You know, to what extent am I developing sophisticated emotional intelligence? And doing the same for those around us so that we know best how to interact with them. And meta-contextual intelligence, which I think is something that is hugely undervalued and underestimated. And yet it's amazing that as humans in the world, we can really move seamlessly. Different locations, interact with different people, learn about different things, really with very few bumps along the way. Yes, of course, sometimes there's a jog as we move into a different location and it's not quite as we expected it to be. But in the days when we can travel, I think most of us would feel that we could book a flight to most anywhere in the world, get off the plane, find our way through the airport, get ourselves to a hotel or whatever lodging we're staying in, probably get to order a meal. May not be exactly what we thought it was, but we can do it. And actually that's incredible. That ability to move intelligently throughout the world is incredible and highly underestimated. And then really there's this notion of accurate perceived self-efficacy, which is when we as humans, using all these elements, are able to set goals, to understand how likely we are to achieve those goals, to know what we need to learn and be able to do to achieve those goals, to know who might be able to help us, to know how to go about getting that help and assistance, to be able to assess how we're feeling about that, how close we are to achieving a goal, who might help us. All of these things can lead us to be very self-effective. We're not necessarily, as humans, naturally good at all of this, but we can learn to be. But for our AI peers, really, it's only on that one side of the screen where they can be intelligent. So yes, interdisciplinary academic intelligence, and to an extent, yes, meta-knowing in terms of evidence to justify beliefs. Social intelligence to an extent, but it's not in the same way as our social intelligence. But certainly, you know, we work with AI peers, they interact. There is an element of social intelligence in there. But really those meta-intelligences are very, very tough for AI. This ability to reflect on oneself is not something that's a natural part of a machine learning AI system. And that's a real challenge. It's not for us. We might find it difficult, but we certainly can achieve those things. And if anybody wants to know the research behind what I've just said there, it's in this book. It's not just about small children making robots, it's about human intelligence, whatever age you are. So if we think about our 7-step framework, we had hopefully got people enthused and excited about what AI can achieve, maybe showing them some of the systems that I discussed at the start of the talk. And then we've tried to encourage people to think about the differences between artificial and human intelligence and think about some of the challenges that they face within their environment so that we can then decide whether this is what you might call an AI compatible challenge. Is this challenge something that there's any way that AI might be able to help us with? Because often what happens is you've got more than one challenge. In fact, as an educator, I know I have more than one challenge, and I'm sure every educator in the room knows they have more than one challenge. So how do you decide between the two challenges? So we came up with these 10 criteria that are quite useful for differentiating between different challenges. And the challenge I'm going to use in this worked example is really about how we can know anything about all of the thousands of lessons that happened when suddenly at the start of pandemic, learning was moved online. Thousands of lessons, hundreds of students in our school, for example, say, or college. And how can we know what happened in those lessons in a way that's useful, that could help inform how we would perhaps redesign the way we provide online tuition or not, depending on how things had gone? How can we really find out what's happened and assure ourselves that good quality teaching and learning has been provided? That is quite a big challenge, but it's certainly one that we could look at using some AI, and in the process understand more about that challenge and also understand more about AI. And so this is what we do with the teachers that we work with. And by the way, when the book comes out in February, there'll also be an online training course for teachers that coincides with it, where you can go and work through these steps. So now we need to think about the data, bearing in mind data is really important. And so in a way, this is going back to some basic research methods. What data do I need? I want to look at these thousands of lessons, and I want to find out about the quality of what happened in a way that's going to be useful for my team, useful for me if I'm a school leader. So what data do I need? Well, certainly we need to think about what's already been gained through previous research studies to learn about the data that we might use. So it's always important to remember that there are other things out there, and we can always find useful things. So these are 2 free resources that I think are quite useful, and I always stress to educators the need to look at what's already out there to understand more about a particular challenge, but also to understand about the kinds of data that can be helpful. So let's imagine that we've done that. And now we need to think about what relevant data can I access? What have I got access to? And then how do we bring those 2 types of things together, the learning we can get from existing data and research and the data that we've got? And so it's about helping, at this stage, it's very much about helping educators, trainers, organizations to think about what data they have. And often people ignore certain sorts of data because they don't necessarily associate them with understanding about teaching and learning. So, for example, there could be data about sound levels or heating levels in the place where learners are working. There could be lots of sorts of data that you don't necessarily see as having a direct impact on teaching and learning, but absolutely does. So let's have a think about the sorts of data, the ingredients, as I call them, to think about the ingredients for our machine learning so that we can understand more about what's going on. There could be some conversational data, perhaps from the online lessons, perhaps from in classrooms. I know a lot of students and a lot of schools in the UK, and I understand in other parts of the world too, use systems like Iris, which records classroom interactions as video and audio. We might have recordings of online lessons. We might have recordings of one-to-one sessions. We're absolutely sure to have some kind of performance data about student performance, highly likely to have some log data, particularly from those online learning sessions, and maybe some recordings of students interacting in those online lessons. We might even be able to decipher some eye tracking. It's unlikely we'll have some eye tracking data directly, but you never know, we might do. But we might be able to look at analyze video to identify something simple like direction of gaze, might have some hand movement data, gesture data, possibly some data from body sensors or movements. These are less likely, I realize, but they're all the kinds of data that could be. But for our example, let's imagine that we have a certain set of data available to us in a particular organization. So we've got some log data, highly likely to have this from interactions with technology, including button clicks. We've got some audio data, and we've got some performance data, and we've got some video data. That's all very nice. We've also got some historical data from tests and interviews, all very helpful, and the videos in there as well. We've even got some video data from which we can get some very coarse-grained eye movements. That's a really nice collection of data, and we certainly encourage educators to look as broadly as possible at the potential data sources they already have available to them. But then we need to think about, well, what else might be useful? So we've got all these ingredients already, but actually, what about some behavioural data? Perhaps we need to survey teachers, staff, parents, how did they feel when they were doing the online learning? Were they anxious? Did they feel confident? Did teachers feel students were engaged? What was going on there, for example, the kind of thing that we could collect via a survey. And as always, ethics is vital, hence the acronym for the framework. We have to be thinking every time we're interacting, using people's data. And I think in education more than any other sphere, we have to ensure that we behave ethically. And then it gets to the exciting part. And of course, this is the part that for most educators is not part of their repertoire. And that's where we come in as an organization to help with this stage in the process. But even if we can't actually do it with the teachers with their own data, stepping through this is a useful tool in helping people to understand. So if we think about our data, those ingredients that I was just showing earlier, let's get them back up there again. So if we think about these ingredients, and let's use an analogy of baking. I know Bake Off's finished and not everybody watches Bake Off. It's not broadcast all over the world, but imagine some kind of cooking show and you have your ingredients there. But first of all, you've got to think about, well, what kind of cooking am I going to use? So in the same way as when we look at that data, a lot of the time teachers will say, well, how do I know, even if I knew where to get this AI that I'm going to apply to the data, what type of AI do I use? Well, this is a bit like the cooking thing. So there's lots of different ways of cooking, but it's all cooking. And the way that you choose the different sorts of cooking is in accordance with your ingredients and what you want to achieve. So we go back to our ingredients again, and we think about, what do we want to achieve? Well, we really want to achieve an understanding of what happened when learning went online for all students. But in some cases, some students still coming to the physical school in the UK, that would have been the case for emergency workers, for example. But let's pick up the cooking analogy again. So we've got some ingredients. We know we want to achieve something. We want to understand what happened in these thousands of lessons, and the ingredients are about those thousands of lessons. So we need to bring those ingredients, those data ingredients, together in a way that will help us derive some understanding. So in a lot of cooking shows, you get the situation where it's a competition and you're there with your fellow competitors, and you know that under this cover there are a set of ingredients and you are going to have to make something from this set of ingredients. So let's pretend we've got this and we pull back the cover, and this is what we find. We've got some eggs, we've got some raspberries, we've got some cream, and we've got some sugar. And we have been told that we have to make some individual portioned desserts. So that's the challenge. That's what we've got to achieve. And here are our ingredients. In the same way that we need to decide what algorithm, what type of AI to apply to our data ingredients, we need to think about what type of cooking is appropriate for this sort of ingredients when we want to produce that tasty set of desserts. Well, I don't think grilling is going to work, and I can't imagine boiling or broiling or frying. It's really going to be baking, isn't it? So we've immediately honed in on a particular type of cooking that we're going to apply to these ingredients. And that's exactly what we do when it comes to our machine learning. We now need to decide what our end product, we know it's got to be individual desserts, but is it going to be raspberry meringues or raspberry souffle? I absolutely go for the raspberry souffle anytime. So we decide that's what we're going to do. In the same way, we have our ingredients. Our ingredients this time are data. And we know that we want to use this data, we want to combine this data together, processing it just as we do when we make those raspberry soufflés, by processing the ingredients and in some cases cleaning those ingredients. But instead of producing the soufflés, we are going to be producing increased understanding about the nature of learning and teaching that happened across those thousands of lessons that were delivered online or in hybrid settings where some students were in a classroom and some students were learning online. Excuse me while I just have another drink. So let's get those ingredients back up again and start thinking about the next step. We need to think about the workflow. So when we think about our cooking, we know we have a particular workflow, a method we would call it. So we've got the same thing here. Let's now put our ingredients on the left-hand side of the screen. Okay, this is the stuff we're starting with, and we've got to process it. Now, what does that mean? So if I think about the cooking, when we're starting with our ingredients, we have to clean that fruit. We've got to clean that fruit before we can use it. We have to break the eggs and we have to beat the eggs. We have to take the cream and we have to whip the cream. And we have to mix all of those things together with the cream, the eggs, the raspberries, and the sugar. And we hold some of those raspberries back to make the souffle. So we've got a lot of cleaning and processing. And then we can put those souffles in the oven. It's the same with these ingredients. We've got to collate them, we've got to clean them, we've got to organize them, we've got to transform them. We've got to take them. But perhaps we don't want to take all of them. In the same way that we reserve some of those raspberries to go on the top of the souffle, we're going to reserve that behavioral data and we're just going to process the rest of that data. Now, generally, this stage in what we do takes about 85 to 90% of the time, this preparing. And actually, it can be complicated, but a lot of it can be done by people who are not necessarily experts in AI. The point is that it all has to be cleaned and brought together. We need to look for values that are clearly wrong. We need to look, for example, in labels in data where in one set it says male and female and in another it says girl and boy. There's lots of ways that we need to work with this data to turn it into a set that we can use, just in the same way that we cleaned and we processed all those ingredients to make those souffles. But what we want to produce rather than our lovely souffles is interaction profiles. We want to get to know what the core features of those thousands of lessons were and derive from that a set of characteristics, a set of profiles of lessons with different characteristics that differentiate all those thousands of lessons from each other and put them into groups or profiles. And then we can start learning what really happened. So we need to think about this using a cluster analysis technique to group the different sorts of lessons according to common features so that we can build up these, if you like, lesson profiles, these interaction profiles. And this is certainly what we've done in the past with data sets like this. We've found different features that really differentiate between that large set of lessons in this particular instance. And that's a great example of where AI and human intelligence can work together in finding potential features. But if we take this example, then in this example, we may find that there are 4 key features that account for, say, 85% of the difference between all those different lessons. And that is the amount of time active by students. So how active were students when they were taking these lessons? Where were they? Were they the students who were in the school because their parents were working in hospitals or whatever, or were they the students who were at home or wherever they were learning out of school? What was the style of the interaction? Was it whole school, a whole class, sorry, or was it small group? And was there any extra technology used in these lessons in addition to the online platform? Now that's interesting in and of itself. We know the key features that differentiate our lessons, but it doesn't really tell us a lot about the quality, though we might compare those profiles perhaps to performance outcomes. But actually, we could also look at that behavioral data that we collected using that survey, and we didn't combine it with the rest of the ingredients. And maybe we find out, for example, that actually, if we look at student confidence, the average level of self-reported confidence about learning from students, we may find that actually this particular profile of interaction yielded higher confidence among students. So these are students who are mainly at home, mainly active, and they're using some kind of additional technology to the online learning platform. And we may also compare the teachers' views about whether students were paying attention, were they focused, and look to see how that maps to the profiles. And here we see that actually it's the fourth profile. So it's the students who are in school working in small groups that actually were the ones that the teachers felt were the most focused. So remember, this is just an example, but the point of this is to help illustrate the kinds of things that AI-driven analysis can do, and the kinds of things that those machine learning algorithms inside those systems are doing when they process data. But this data is very contextualized. It's contextualized to the particular educators or educational organization who is going through this process of becoming AI ready. So I think it's important to think about this, not least because there are some amazing possibilities when it comes to AI. When we think about connections to neuroscience, and we think about whether we could really connect our understanding of the way that the brain learns with what's happening as people are learning socially in classrooms, in homes, we would need to connect a lot of disciplines in order to be able to do that. Oh, sorry, that was a bit quick. But certainly there are ways in which we could start doing this. But if we're going to be doing this really sophisticated blending of neuroscience, machine learning, education, engineering, we really need teachers and learners to understand enough about that AI to really understand what's going on. We may be able to build maps, and this is a real example from a research project of the way in which students are feeling, or how the extent to which their brain activity indicates that they are categorizing, or are they reflecting. These are all possible. We can have our virtual glasses to see when students need help, even if they don't realize. There are huge possibilities for building these kinds of systems that not only use AI, but use many other types of science and engineering as well. And so it's even more important that we help teachers to understand enough about AI in order to stand a chance of leveraging these amazing technologies to the benefit of students. And that's back to my final point, which is very much about ethics. I think always, 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 we need to question ourselves about whether what we are doing is ethical. And education is a key part of that, because unless we educate people to understand enough, they're not in a position to contribute to keeping themselves safe, because regulation will never be enough because it can't keep up. So thank you very much for listening. I know you're going to share these slides, so I included a few papers there, and I've also got some discussion prompts. You may have other things you want to discuss, but I put these down in case they were useful for sparking off some discussion.
Let's just say a big jazz hands, clappy. Well, thank you to Rose.
My pleasure.
That's absolutely brilliant. Well, yeah, I'm really, really absorbing. Thank you so much. But we want to go and we'll come back shortly to ask you some questions. I think we should probably move quite swiftly into breakout rooms for 15 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. And looking forward to hearing your questions. I can see already that Prashant has got a question for Rose. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, Hi, Rose. This is Prashant.
Hi there.
I'm actually a software developer. I'm not a educator, but my interests are more in terms of is there any open source tool which can help me do analytics in the background? I mean, things something like if I'm using Moodle or some other open source tool with my students, I'm probably would be interested to do the analytics in background, which can help me make informed decisions or maybe personalize the learning for them automatically. I know there are things, some of the tools you have mentioned, which probably would be proprietary. I was more like,
Yes, and I don't know. There are certainly proprietary tools. My instinct would be go to GitHub, but I think I've got a colleague who's doing something similar at the moment. I'll ask him if the tool he's using is open source or not. And if it is, I'll let Sue know, because I'm sure she'll know how to in some way let you know. But I don't know of an open source tool. I'm sure there will be one. I mean, to be honest, with the analysis we do, we mainly use freely available things. But that's different because we're analyzing data sets that we've collected in a different way to what you're talking about, actually plugging into the back of Moodle.
Yeah, the reason is obviously it has to integrate with something which is a standard platform. So Moodle has XML, QML. There are many standard ways of representing maths, LaTeX.
There are.
So it should integrate with the existing one, and then it would work.
I know exactly what you mean. I don't have a good answer for you for something that's open source, but I'm sure they're there. But I know, as I say, that I've got a colleague who's doing this at the moment with their students. So let me find out for you and see if I can get that message passed on to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Pleasure. I'm just making a note so that I don't forget.
Brilliant. Yes, well, we do share feedback from the seminars with everybody that's attended. I have before I go on to the chat question, I have a quick question for you, Rose. So we've been in the last few seminars been talking a lot about AI for children, and I love the way you talk about, you know, how you're working with educators, showing worked examples, showing what you can do with data. I think, you know, because we're not going to get anywhere with children unless we think about educators. I think that's fantastic. So Mike, as you've done all this work with educators, what are you finding that are the barriers? What are teachers worried about? What do they think about AI? Do you mean, are they worried about it taking over their, taking over their role as teacher or whatever? You know, what's your experience of that?
It's hugely varied, but in the main, if I'm honest, I think for most teachers, it is something that's scary and they haven't got time to think about it. That's the honest truth. But there are now more and more teachers who are starting to think about how AI could be used, and more school leaders. For the first time this year, I've been approached by a couple of schools about helping them to develop their AI strategy. And that's interesting, because that was something that, yes, you were seeing a bit of in universities, but not so much in the school sector. I think there's a lot of fear. So I absolutely think there's a lot of fear. And in a way, that's why trying to unpack it so much. But I think the biggest challenge from somebody like myself, who wants to help teachers understand AI, is to get them to want to understand it in the first place, to want to know about it. You know, there are a small community who really, really do. But for most people, I think, and I understand it, there's so much going on. And this is another thing that I haven't got time to think about. And it's scary because surely it's going to take my job. And even if I don't think it's going to take my job, you know, I see all the stuff about Facebook going on, and it's just too much. That's where a lot of people are. And I think the way to break that down has to be through helping people to understand it more.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's, you know, what's really lovely about your approach.
The other thing that's a challenge, sorry, I'll just say this bit and then I will shut up so we can about the other thing. I was on a session this morning with European SchoolNet, and one of the people presenting in the same session was saying that, you know, we don't need to worry about AI because so many parts of the world can't even afford the basic technology, let alone anything that will run AI. And I can see how that kind of view would come about, but actually you can still help people to understand AI because it might help them to understand more about their situation, even if we have to do it from the outside. So there's still an argument, I think, for helping people to understand it in advance of being in a position to apply it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to, there's a few questions in the chat. I'll just pull out, let's hear from Simon Johnson, because I can see him in the chat, and he can ask his question. And after that, I'll come to Manal, who's asked a question in the chat. So we'll go to those two next.
You just answered my question, because you was asking the same question as I was typing it. So it just, I come across the same questions when I'm talking about AI. I use AI all the time. So I use Power BI in Teams and Microsoft. Yeah. I use the new comprehension reading tools in Teams. And things like the immersive reader, really powerful. My concern is, when does it stop? And when does the teacher, when does it take over the teacher? And that's one of the questions a lot of people are asking. I think we're starting to, it's less of a question, but more of an observation. I think we're starting to have the same conversations now about AI that we did about automation back in the 80s and the 90s. And I think AI is not going to take over jobs like automation did take over jobs. I think jobs are going to change. I think the role of the teacher is going to change as well. But getting that message across is going to be difficult.
And that relates to what you also said about working with AI. You know, I think one of the toughest challenges that we have to get right is to work out how the human and the AI interact together, particularly in educational settings, to bring most advantage. You know, what's that interface? At what point do we want the teacher to step in because we don't want the AI to make that decision? And at what level are we happy? And how do we help teachers to be able to move that according to what they think is appropriate? Because that's really important, and I think very difficult.
Yeah, great. So I'll go to Manal for her question. And after that, Catherine's got a different topic, so we'll go to that question after that. So Manal, do you want to, sorry if I pronounced it wrong.
No, it's perfect. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the presentation today and for providing a platform to have this discussion. My question is around, so I'm not a teacher, but to me, I have 2 young kids under the age of 5. And when I'm teaching them about machine learning and AI, it's primarily through the element of play. Like they talk to Google, and you know, we talk about like, hey Google, what sound does a dog make? And all of a sudden, you know, my living room starts barking. And so there's an element of play and empathy that humans start developing with machines. And this goes to the earlier comment around co-creation with AI. And it seemed, I understand you went into the very basics of like data, how data trains machines, and you know, it's a specific kind of learning. But to appeal to the imagination of children, it's more around interacting with the AI gameplay. Yeah. I mean, all the younger kids have play-based education curriculum. Yeah. So for me, I'm trying to understand how play fits into the teaching of these curriculums beyond just like check, you know, coding, check, Python, check, Java, check. I mean, those are just little building Lego blocks. You know, where's the castle?
Oh, absolutely. And the reason we approach the educational space for teachers in the way we do it is because we're trying to get them to see how you build something for their castle, their school. That's why it's so important that it's contextualized. Actually, you're making me think about whether we ought to have more play in the kind of adult version of trying to learn with AI. I agree with you. I think that interacting, that being playful with AI, experimenting, but I think that comes much more naturally, doesn't it, to younger children. As we become older, it comes less naturally for us to play. But but I do think it would be interesting to take a kind of more, perhaps a more playful look at exactly how we could put play within the way that we're trying to help educators understand education. I realize that wasn't your question, sorry, that was just what you really made me think about when you were talking about play. But I absolutely think that you're right with younger children. I mean, it's also about that co-creation, isn't it? I think the best applications of AI will be the ones that are co-created, because they'll lead to a more knowledgeable non-AI expert population and much more appropriate AI applications. So I think anything we can do to broker those relationships where you have multi-stakeholder partnerships, whatever age, and it's about testing ideas, about building things together, that's got to be really the best way forward. I completely agree with you. And it's not always easy to bring about. I mean, I think it's a space where perhaps community approaches can be very powerful. You know, so perhaps you have a school and they can work with some people in the local community, some employers, whatever, and you can kind of together look at how you can sort of demystify some of these things by creating something together. But the way I've seen this work very well is always in very well resourced independent schools, and not everybody has that, you know, so we need to try and think about how you could make something like that more available for everybody, I think. But definitely bringing multiple stakeholders to co-creation partnerships, absolutely, and I don't see why that shouldn't happen with younger learners involved as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So I said I'd go to one of Catherine's questions, because that's the question one. I think Catherine's a different topic, and then I'll come. Martin sitting there patiently with his hand up, so I'll go to Martin, then I'll go to Codefinity. I'm trying to get around everybody. Catherine, you're next.
Thank you. Yeah, so we had a really interesting discussion in our group. Thank you for such a stimulating talk. We were thinking particularly about the worked example that you shared, and we fully appreciated that there may be nuances in this that we didn't have time to cover. So that's where we wanted to ask a little bit more. But we were thinking particularly about the collection of student data and the ethics involved with the stakeholders of that. And we were thinking about whether this was a challenge in terms of creating educational disadvantage if a student had opted out of the data collection from the activities and things, and whether you'd come across that. And if so, how you would go about dealing with that kind of stakeholder ethics?
Absolutely. I think the whole ethical question is enormous. And yes, I have come across that. And I can understand why it happens. Because if you don't understand something and you believe it's going to do harm, then you're not going to let your child do it, are you? And I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to AI in education is actually addressing the fact that, for me, it feels unethical not to try and make it possible for everybody to have access to these advanced technologies, because they can be so helpful and they could be such a powerful tool for greater equality. So I recognize the scenario that you're painting, and really the only way is, and it's time consuming, and that's why it also brings challenges if we're trying to sort of move the social mobility dial, so to speak, is to actually help people understand why they should say yes. And this comes back to this idea about truly informed consent, because I think a lot of the time people give consent, but they're not really informed. They don't really understand what they're giving consent to, because they don't have the understanding to hook that consent onto, if you see what I mean. I think we have to be super careful, because for most people in the world, why would they understand anything about how AI works? It's not, nobody's been taught it in school, or hardly anybody, and it's not something we can naturally expect. So I think we need to be very careful about that. And one of the best ways that I've seen, and actually we're about to try and use it in a particular project at the moment, is to actually help even young learners to build their own informed consent. So to actually create the consent form with the people, because in order to create it, they need to understand enough about what that consent can be bringing. And I think that engaging people in the process helps them to feel less like it's being done to them, even though they're giving their consent, and something that they've been part of. So that's the way that I've seen it work quite well.
Lovely.
It's a very important question, though.
Yes, yes, thank you. I'm glad we got a chance to ask it. So Martin, you're next, and then Codefinity.
You just answered my question.
Hi, Martin. Oh.
I had the same question as Catherine.
Oh, right. Okay.
Well, it is a very important question, so I'm glad I answered it.
Yeah,
Thank
brilliant. You. Okay, Codefinity, do you want to? We don't know your real name, so.
Actually, my company's name is Codefinity. Sorry, it was logged in. My name is Abhijit.
Hi there.
I'm from India, and I run an edtech company in India. And as we all are from education background, we all know that India is doing a lot in education technology.
Yes.
Everybody heard about Byju's.
Yes.
Just crossed a valuation of $19 billion. And not that every week there is an unicorn in India. Around 8-9 companies, and few companies that were started by my friends, they have crossed $1 billion. And Whitehead Junior and a lot of other companies that are working into specific coding in K-12 segment, they're doing really well. And a lot of edtech companies have included coding, AI, data science in K-12 segment. And currently I started using Raspberry Pi as a medium to introduce the backward section of the society. Those didn't have the opportunity and paying capacity to use computer and get connected to the digital world. They are converting a Raspberry into a desktop is quite affordable. So a lot of students started learning Scratch and MIT and started taking online classes using Raspberry Pi. So thank you for that, the community Raspberry. You are doing a wonderful job. And I actually want my question is that in India, like the challenges that I am facing to bring AI to all the students and make them learn AI and the future emerging technologies is that we are lacking good people who can curate good curriculum. Okay, and the other thing that we are lacking is to even if we created some curriculum, then to take it to the masses and to the students who don't have computers and hardwares, because India is a third world country, but it is doing good into the education system. We are teaching almost in the edtech industry, like we have around 50 to 60% market capture. A lot of Indian teachers and Indian people are ruling the YouTube and making edtech videos and education videos. So I think if we started producing a good quality, we have mass education, but if we can produce quality education, then it could be good. So just my question is that how can we create a good curriculum that is interesting for the students and that is actually good and will help student to curate vocational learnings and get the taste of the part of the world that is entering into technology, and the students who are not able to catch that train can easily learn all those things.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And actually, I'm going to pass it back to Sue in a moment because she's probably in a better position to comment on resources for students, because well, I agree that's really, really important, but I'm concerned about at the moment the way that actually we don't have the educators to help students understand. So it's important to get that curriculum. I'm totally on board with that, but I'm trying to sort of capacity build in the educator so that they're more able to help those students. But I know, Sue, you've been doing some work, I know with sort of computing, but also I believe now looking at AI more for learners. And actually, I think you've had previous speakers in these seminars who've talked about that.
Yes, so that's one of the reasons for having these seminars, because we're hearing from all these experts from around the world who are developing resources for young learners. And as Jane pointed out in the chat, we're developing a kind of a document where we're sharing everything that everybody's sharing, so we can form this community, exactly as you said, to share these materials. But there is a question, and we've raised it in other seminars, and I won't rehearse it here, but there's still a lot we still have to learn. We can't just make stuff. We need to know what concepts are appropriate. There's a lot more research to be done in this area. But yeah, so I mean, do keep coming to our seminars, because that's what we're here for. We want to keep sharing and building this community. Yeah. In the interest of time, I've just got probably time for maybe 2 more quick questions. I think AI, not a person here called AI. Jane has got a good specific question, and Ethel had a specific question from her group. So as they're presumably in different groups, so that we have heard from every group, and then we'll probably need to wrap up. Jane, is that okay?
Hi, Rose. Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. You're always such a great presenter, so thank you very much. And I really loved the analogy of the crude oil, and data is very crude, isn't it? And very messy.
It is.
Anyway, we had a question, or really I had a question about, we've got all this data, but are there already constraints or limitations with what we can do, particularly around what we can do with children's data that profiles them and then automatically makes decisions about saying, oh, well, this child's not going to do so well as this child. And I don't know, I always feel a little bit nervous about that.
I feel very uncomfortable. Yeah, I agree with you. I feel very uncomfortable with that. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is help develop the sort of profile that actually is accessible to students, and so they can reflect on their own performance and even challenge what the AI is saying. And again, with teachers, the same. It's back to something that was mentioned in a previous question about at what point do we have to have that human in the loop, and at what point are we happy for the AI to make a decision. So we might be happy for the AI, for example, to decide that if we've coded some eye tracking data, that we're happy for the AI to make a decision about, say, the synchronicity of where students are looking. Are they looking at the same thing? Are they looking at each other? That kind of low-level decision, yeah, we're probably quite happy for the AI to make. And we're probably quite happy for the AI to combine that eye tracking data maybe with some hand movement data. And you know, if we've got coordinated hand movements and coordinated eye movements, we might be happy for the AI to label this, to add one sort of identifier of being, you know, the synchronicity. But then what does that mean? You know, and what does that mean for the student when we combine it with maybe 20 or more other small identifiers? So we're probably, again, happy for the AI to combine the things. But when it comes to what does that mean for the student, we might be a bit queasy about it. And I think that's right. You know, most of the adaptive platforms are doing, you know, if they're well designed, quite effective adapting in an effective way, but it's quite small scale steps. What we don't want is what I think you're referring to, Jane, and it's something I worry about a lot, where the AI decides that this student's not going to be good at this and therefore they go over there, or, you know, it's like the last thing you want, isn't it? You know, so we have to be really wary about it and make sensible decisions about. But again, that's why we need more people to understand AI, so that they can challenge what the AI is doing in an effective way.
I like what you said about that transparency, and if models can be built, well, because students have to give consent,
yes,
for their data to be used, and even if they're very young, if it's influencing how they're taught and what they're taught. So that was a great answer. Thanks ever so much.
Good. Pleasure. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Now, I had Ethel lined up. I'm so sorry, Ethel, we've run out of time. But your questions in the chat, and we will share the chat with everybody who came to the seminar, so you can see, and we do collate resources, that anything that's shared in the chat we will add to as a resource, we'll add to our list, because it's just been such an interesting
great discussion. Thank you for the questions.
Discussion. Yeah, so another big jazz hands and clap for Rose. Thank you very much for a really, really great seminar. We've please have a look at the survey that we're doing. So we're trying to run a survey so that we can see the impact of our seminars and what you like and don't like. So please do give us that feedback. We'd really really like to hear that. If you're this is our last seminar before the festive season and the holidays. But after that, we've got a seminar on January the 11th. Here we are on my screen now. So on 11th of January, we've got Dave Turetsky and Fred Martin, and Dave Turetsky is well known for introducing the AI in K-12. You go to AI k12.org, the kind of the 5 big ideas of AI. So they're talking about that. And then we've got 2 more speakers from the US, taking us up to March. So we've still got more to go. And we'd love to see you there.